welcome to the Casey Growing Good podcast. I'm Nadia Vanderkoop. You're one of your co-hosts.
And I'm Marku Costomo, one of your co-hosts, and really looking forward to today's episode. We're going to be talking about growing good and healthy. So what does organizational growth look like when it's healthy? And we're going to start with some of our own pain points and what our experience has been, and then maybe use some more gardening and ecological metaphors for healthy growth for nonprofits. And we're talking about nonprofits in the 5 million and under, just to give you a bit of a sense of scale and scope. Although what we talk about would be applicable to departments within larger nonprofits as well. So, Nadia, what's your experience been around growth that hasn't been so healthy?
Yeah, I think it's a question that I think many of us ask in the nonprofit space. We talked a little bit in our first episode about how the need always sort of outstrips our capacity. And for me, working in nonprofits, I think the impetus is always to grow and to grow quickly, to show numbers to your donors and to your board so that everybody's happy and feels validated by the work. But sometimes that growth is unsustainable or in the wrong direction. And for me, I've definitely experienced rapid growth without the undergirding of resources, staff, capacity, and eventually that sort of all begins to tip over in ways that can be really harmful to both the people that you're serving and to the people in the nonprofit itself. What about you? Have you had that too?
Yeah, well, I have had that. And I would also say I'm going to own this, Nadia. I've been the cause of that sometimes.
Really?
Yeah.
Surprising.
So I have a little bit of an entrepreneurial streak, and I think sometimes that has been like a huge advantage and blessing. And sometimes that has been, there's been impact on the organization and the team because I'm moving quickly and pushing the organization too quickly as a CEO or executive director. So, but I have seen both the fruit of good growth and healthy growth,
Right.
and the impacts of growing too quickly and getting, maybe you could say, if we start to move into ecological metaphors already, you could say the plant, when it grows too quickly, uh, it's not, the roots aren't there. And the stem might not be strong enough, so it starts to lean over.
Yeah.
I know you're a gardener, Nadia. What sort of gardening metaphors do you bring into thinking about healthy growth for organizations, for nonprofits?
Yeah, so I call myself a little hobby urban farmer. I like to grow a lot of the fruits and vegetables my family eats. And so, in the spring, you get really excited and you throw a bunch of seeds in the dirt, things start popping up. And, when it starts to grow, you realize, oh, I might have planted too thickly in one area and you've got to sort of pluck out, you got to prune. Right now, it's tomato season in the garden. And if you don't prune tomatoes, you actually don't get really good fruit. But pruning can be so painful because you think you're clipping away all this potential of more fruit, but what you're actually doing is directing all the energy, to the strongest parts of the tomato plant so that you get a bigger harvest. But the process can be very painful and very, at times, can leave your tomato plant looking kind of sickly because it doesn't have all this foliage and leaves because you've clipped them away in order for the energy to go to the fruit. So, you have these ebbs and flows of rapid growth, clipping back, and then fruit. But you got to be patient. And that's sort of the key to it.
Yeah, that's a great metaphor. The pruning, whether it's with tomatoes or other plants or trees. Tomatoes, it's like you're looking at maybe a quarterly cycle, because it's like.
That's right.
But if you're pruning trees, you're looking at more like the 3-year strategic plan and what branches are you going to keep? What can you
Right.
kill? So in fruit trees, you can always cut anything dead or cross, where the branches are crossing anytime, then there's a specific time of year to really think about how do you want the tree to grow in which direction and make decisions. And that's hard. You're making decisions to cut off this branch that looks really good. Uh,
Yeah, exactly.
and it actually does bear fruit. But for the long-term plan, you might, for the tree to be stable and balanced, you might need to prune back a
Hmm.
particular branch, or in the concept of a nonprofit, in this metaphor, a particular program area.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And then there's the seasonality, even in your tomato plant metaphor.
for sure.
Is the early on, there's a lot of root growth. So, like, enabling plants to focus on that root growth. And that's more like maybe the trees, my area. the
Yeah, you're definitely the tree guy.
love trees. I love hanging out in forests. Anything else coming from your gardening metaphor?
Well, I think too, one of the things that happens in a season of rapid growth, let's stick with my tomato plants, is eventually I have to trellis them or provide some sort of support because they get too heavy and they get too big. And so if I don't, put stakes in, string them up, provide some sort of support, they'll eventually bend over and break at the stem, at the root, because it just can't hold the weight of what's happening higher up in the plant. And so I think about that a lot when I'm thinking about the organizations we're working with. I feel like Casey sometimes is that trellis coming alongside of these organizations and saying, "Hey, you're doing all this great work. There's tons of fruit. Let us come alongside of you and just sort of hold you up as you continue to figure out which way to grow and which way to go." And provide that support. So yeah, I get a lot of, I do a lot of thinking in the garden, and it always sort of circles back to this idea of growth, sees slower seasons, fallow seasons. The gardening calendar is sort of, it always has ebbs and flows in it, and so it feels very appropriate to the work that we're doing.
Well, I love that metaphor. I'm going to throw another one in from the forest background. In a previous vocation, I was a forest ecologist and did a lot of forest ecosystem mapping. So I would come in and assess the ecosystem. And I kind of look at that when I come into a nonprofit now, coming alongside a nonprofit, is what does the ecosystem look like for this nonprofit? Are there pieces missing? Sometimes it's like, oh, beautiful trees, but there's no understory. There's no plants underneath it. Or whoa, these trees are growing really quickly, but they haven't had time to grow their roots yet. So is it balanced? So the idea of a integrated ecosystem approach, even for fundraising, means that the communications is well integrated. There's time being put into relationships. So all of these pieces, like in the forest, for example, you've got the tree roots, but then you also have all the mycorrhizal fungi that are like
Yeah,
connecting
the underground.
on all the
Yeah,
stuff that's underground. So it's all this relational connections and phone calls and coffees, and that you don't necessarily see results or fruit
right.
from, but all of it makes this healthy ecosystem and for a forest to thrive, and for an organization to thrive and be fruitful,
Right.
grow good and grow healthy. Yeah, there's elements that need to be a part of that ecosystem. So I was thinking about, like, honing in on 6 parts of that ecosystem, or 6 principles. And I'm wondering, what do you think about the first one being mission and vision? What do you think about that as part of that healthy growth? What do you think? What have you seen in organizations that have been really clear on that, where it's been helpful?
Yeah, I mean, every organization, when you first go in, you learn about their mission and vision. And sometimes it's a really pithy one-liner that's easy to understand what they're doing. Sometimes it's these long paragraphs. But I'm more interested in finding out, is your mission and vision actually driving the work? Is that your true north that you're always coming back to? Or is it a really great statement, but you get pulled away from it and there's mission drift and all that kind of stuff. So for me, I want to know, okay, you have this mission statement. Are you really living into it fully? Have you drifted? I think it's a great tool for us to sort of understand maybe what they had hoped to do. Sometimes we've even gone in and helped organizations recraft their statement to more accurately reflect what they're actually doing instead of it being kind of more vague or aspirational as opposed to maybe what they're actually doing. I can think of a client that we just helped do that, where we really just kind of help them shift and say, no, this is actually what you're doing. So let's say that.
Yeah, it's so helpful. Like, I think even for me in my own life journey, but for organizations, when you can really narrow down what the focus is and
Yeah.
focus in on mission and vision and have a high level goal in there as well as part of that mission and vision that kind of drives the work day to day. But back and look 3 years ahead, it's really clear where you're headed. And then I think that mission and vision do drive the daily work, but we rarely look at it. And so having that kind of sense of
Exactly.
like looking at it at least on a weekly basis in your weekly team meeting, just tying that in naturally as part of that, and your quarterly planning meetings, and then your annual strategy sessions. Yeah,
Yeah. And I think that kind of ties into kind of the next point around people and culture. Your mission and vision can really influence the type of people that you hire or that are involved in the organization and the culture you're building. I think I don't see those as separate things. Kind of back to your ecosystem and your mycelium, network. These things don't operate in silos. Your mission and vision will affect who A wants to work for you and B what kind of culture you're trying to form. When you look at someone's mission and vision and then you look at their staff team or the culture they build and you see a disconnect, is that a flag for you, or you're like, you know, do we address that organizationally, or is that it doesn't really matter? What do you think?
yeah, I think it matters a whole lot. I mean, the people are I think, the most valuable resource an organization has, and so I think staff well-being and staff feeling like their passions are aligned with the mission of the organization is really important. So staff well-being is it's not a nice to have, like it's critical part of it.
Yeah.
And I know I've done this. I've been doing this myself. Sometimes it is just adding on extra pieces for a staff or team member to do. Like, so just like scope
Mhm.
creep on their role. And that's
Yeah.
going back to your pruning metaphor, is like, I think there should be an annual pruning of team job descriptions. Like, what is your job description right now? Wow, this past year, your job description like grew, like it's like tripled in size.
Yeah.
So I don't think we spend enough time with team members going, what is it that you love doing? What is it that you're really great at? And what is it that you could stop doing so that you can do the really good stuff that you're really great at and good at? And then, of course,
I don't know a single ED that does that. I have never run into a single ED that's like, let me take some stuff off your plate. Like, never. That never happens. It's more likely like, how much more can I slide this on? I think, to be fair, I think we do this at KC. I think we are learning to do this at KC a little bit, where we do these check-ins with our team and, at least quarterly. How's your workload? Do you want more work? Do you want less? But I have never met an AD that's like, let me take it off your plate, let me hire somebody else. And I think that comes back to this like growth mentality where growth outstrips the capacity, and we're not always willing as leaders, I don't think, to take a hard look and say, oh, should I scale back? You know,
sure,
so I think that's aspirational, and I really hope any ED that's listening to it's like, oh, maybe I should do that with my team, but I'm not going to hold my breath.
true. I mean, I have to admit, I've been one of those EDs. But I think now, kind of being in the second half of life, as I look at even our building our team at Casey, I think one of my high values or principles are for as long as you're here, we want to help you build your career
Right.
in the direction that you want to go in. And we want you to be able to just enjoy that work and feel fulfilled in that work and pay you well for that work. And I think that has created maybe a culture where people are feeling valued, and there's a sense of contentment and satisfaction and value. So I mean, not that we're doing doing it perfectly, but I think there is something in there that is really healthy, part of healthy organizational growth.
Well, and I think even this week we kind of experienced that where a team member felt comfortable enough to come to us and say, "Hey, I need to adjust. I need to adjust, how I'm working for you. I love this work. I want to keep doing it, but I need to adjust how I'm doing it. Can we have a discussion about it?" And I walked away from that conversation thinking how grateful I am that we're trying to build this culture of you can always reimagine what you're doing with us.
Mm.
And I think that's a really beautiful thing. And I think, if we can continue to encourage organizations to do that kind of stuff. And I think back to your point around workload, high value point for me is similar, is like, are you in your sweet spot? Are you in this place? Or, back to the gardening metaphor, are you in the right environment? Are you in the right soil to thrive? Is there parts of your job that are just out of your competency, out of your passion, that we can shift to someone else? And how do we adequately resource you to do your work? I think is always a question I'm sort of, when I do my check-ins with team members. Is there anything you need? Are there ways that we can support you better? I think it's a bit of a luxury in Casey. I'm not going to lie. I don't know that I've ever had that luxury in leading nonprofits, but personally wish I had been stronger in advocating for that, for people that I could advocate for. And that's sort of a whole other organizational issue.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for those reflections. I love that. Well, moving to our third principle, the revenue model. What does a healthy revenue model look like in the nonprofit sector, and what are we working towards intentionally? I mean, obviously that's a huge topic, so we're just gonna do something very kind of cursory here, or over at an overview level. But I have found over the years that thinking of revenue in the nonprofit sector as a three-legged stool, and that you're intentionally spending time on all of these and building the three-legged stool. And the ratio may be separate, different. It may not be a third, and third, but those are individual donations or unrestricted funds coming in through individuals or other sources that are unrestricted. And then there are grants, and then earned revenue. So generally, I mean, there's more categories, or you could have subcategories within each of those three-legged stool. But I've found, if we can work towards stability in those three and have a strategy for all three of those, and that there's always action working on those three areas of revenue streams, that starts to bring longer term stability. So, for example, I don't know what the organizations that you've worked with, what those ratios have been, but an organization I worked with, one was we were trying to build our revenue so that 30% was coming from grants, 30% coming from earned revenue, and 40% from individual donors. So that felt like if we could get to that felt like that was like going to be really much more stable and diverse funding. And then there's been organizations that I've worked with where their grant writing was maybe at 5%, and their individual donors were 95%, and earned revenue was at 0. So that,
yeah, that's more my experience. Very unbalanced stool.
yeah. I mean, and sometimes there isn't an opportunity for earned revenue, but
right.
But there's a lot of different ways that there can be earned revenue. So
the next big piece is kind of where a lot of people put a lot of their time and energy, and that's the programs and impact. What are you actually doing as your organization? That takes up, a lot of airspace in organizations, programs and impacts, usually why organizations start, right? So I think this is really, for me, this is one of the heart moments parts. Like this is where you have to take one of the hardest looks in terms of too much, not enough, what stays, what goes, how is that impacted by revenue, how is that impacted by people? What do you think when you think about programs and impact?
Well, I think of it as I'm going to use the metaphor, still staying with our ecological gardening type of metaphor. I look at it as an orchard.
Okay.
And
Okay.
let's say like maybe there's 6 trees in this orchard and they all bear fruit. So
Right.
sometimes we just think, oh, they all bear fruit and they're all doing really well. We're not measuring anything. But the thing
Mm.
is, even in this orchard, you could actually count how many fruit came off, how many pounds of fruit came off of each tree. You can look at them and see if they're healthy. And then we always have people on the team or in the board that have this attachment to a particular tree. And even if the tree is like almost dead and bearing barely any more fruit, they are attached to it. And they're not measuring. I've had one of those. We had a plum tree in our orchard that was like, it's just like, I love plums. I didn't want to let go of this plum tree. And it was just like, it got some sort of disease and well, it wasn't producing anymore. Other people thought, okay, we've got to get rid of this plum. But I was advocating for this plum tree because I really like the plums. And I thought, well, it's going to come back. But the end result was actually pretty dramatic. We cut the tree down and there's grief and loss in that. But I think there is a reality of you can only grow and make change if you're measuring. And you only really know the true impact of what's happening unless you have to be measuring. You need to know what the impact is.
Okay, so question for you. Well, if we're going to stick in this orchard metaphor. So say you have a cherry tree and you have an apple tree. They both produce 100 pounds of fruit, but there's going to be significantly less apples than cherries because it takes a lot more cherries to make up a pound. Are you measuring them cherries to apples? Are you measuring them apples to apples? Like these are the questions, right? Like it's not just about, it'd be easy if a program's dying or it's not working, but when you have similar results but very different sizes or very different measurement things, like how do you figure that out?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. I mean, obviously you do the metrics. So you do both, the quantitative analysis but you also do the storytelling and the qualitative analysis. And so you want a full picture. So if the apples, I mean, and there may be different purposes, like the apples you can store, like there's advantages to apples. So it's hard to I say you'd never really compare apples to cherries. Apples are different. You can store them in a cool place. They last till 10 months. The cherries you've got to eat right away or freeze them, and that rarely happens. So they're different. And I think ultimately then there's also the inputs, the cost of like what's going in, like fertilizing, care, pruning, time, all of that. So I think you start to get a picture of that. And then maybe you want to talk to the people eating the fruit. Do you like cherries or do you like apples? What do you think?
We're going down this real rabbit hole. Sorry. Anybody who's listening, you're like, I didn't come here for a gardening lesson, but here you are.
Yeah, just to summarize again. So programs, like you do want to measure the program. You probably also want to do surveys, focus groups with your participants. Right. Don't compare apples and cherries, but actually look at each program and look at what the analysis is. And also then looking at the stories that are coming out so that whatever metrics you're looking are embedded in stories. Coming out of programs and impact, we're heading into a chat about governance and leadership, or as that is the kind of next principle to look at. So board governance and leadership. And, I've seen this be so strong when there's an active board, as one of my board chairs used to say, noses in for the board, but fingers out. And I always thought that was such a healthy perspective.
Yeah, that sounds ideal.
Uh, so, I mean, you can have it the other way around where the hands and fingers are in, but the noses are out. And the noses meaning are out, meaning that there isn't a real sense of what's happening. You're not really tracking,
Right.
but the a board could be overstepping and putting their fingers and hands into management, and that often brings a lot of tension. And obviously, that the CEO or executive director is responsible to the board. They're responsible for the organization, the day-to-day management, and that relationship between the executive director and the board is really a critical one, and that can help an organization flourish. And that, I think that sometimes that's seen as like yes, the board does have authority over the ED, but it's better seen as a partnership, a side by side.
Yeah.
How can we together bring perspective so that the organization is thriving and flourishing? So there's process as part of that, policy is part of that, protocols are a part of that. Nadia, where have you seen? Do you have a story of like where that's gone not so well?
I mean, I think when we first founded our nonprofit as very young people, we had a board of business folks that had their whole bodies in. So even as we grew as leaders, there wasn't, this kind of pullback. On the flip side of that, much later in my experience, we had a board that just really had a priority of pouring into the leadership of the nonprofit. So they really poured into us as leaders, which then gave us agency and energy to pour into our team members. So it kind of was this trickle. They really saw their role as supporting the key leadership. And, obviously we're committed, financially, and we're committed to oversight and governance, but not in a way that felt like they were kind of overlording us or micromanaging us, but in a very sort of empowering and agency giving way. And I thought that was a real gift in terms of being the person in the in-between there. So yeah, I think it could go both ways. You have to, as a nonprofit leader, be thoughtful about who you ask on the board. You have to have diversity in all sorts of ways, skills, experience, lived experience. I think sometimes we take the next warm body instead of being strategic about who might be the best fit for a board. So yeah, I think there's lots of possibility and potential. And it sounds like you had a great board chair there for a while, noses in, hands out. I like that a lot, actually.
Yeah. Then there's also the leadership team, and I think often I remember my own journey as a young leader in a startup mode where kind of the ED is doing everything, making a lot of decision at the team level. Consultation, yes, but then there's a kind of a moment where actually forming a leadership team and just a leadership team that is thriving and working well together is such a gift. And it takes a lot of intentionality, and I think using strategic planning framework that builds rhythms and systems and processes really helps a leadership team thrive and have the kind of impact, and also then ultimately for the board to be really feel really good about what's happening at the management level where there's a kind of a diversified leadership team. So I think that kind of leads into just the operations and systems as the next principle. And what have you found on that front? Like just thinking about operational frameworks. We've been working with a particular framework that we've helped a lot of organizations implement. But what are your reflections on kind of operating without a framework, and then maybe bringing frameworks into organizations?
Yeah, I mean, you know this about me. I'm a little bit more nerdy. I like process. I like frameworks because I feel like, I used to tell my kids this all the time, like in terms of boundaries and rules that we had for our family. It's like, imagine a soccer field. It's big. You can play in this whole soccer field. But if you insist on playing next to the sidelines, you're always going to go out of bounds. So like just play in this gigantic field we've laid out for you. And, you know, don't always try to, obviously we have our girls were teenagers, now young adults. So there's a lot of sideline play. There's a lot of out of bounds happening. But I think unless you give someone a framework, unless you work within some sort of process and boundaries, people tend to flail and get lost pretty easily. And so I think when you build rhythms and frameworks in which people know where they need to operate and what their capacity within that framework is, I feel like people thrive personally. It can be hard and it can be culture shifting, I think, when you introduce it. But again, I think it's one of these things where you have to be willing to look at your framework constantly, and not just implement and then set it and forget it, but it has to keep iterating and evolving to move with your organization or with your business or however it is. So for me, it's like, I love it. I like the more processes and more things that we can put in KC, not to hem in people, but to set the tracks so that people don't feel like they're kind of left out. But I know not everybody feels that way. I know people in my own family don't feel that way. So I don't know. You are a bit more free flowing than I am. I'm a little bit more rigid that way. So it'd be interesting to know how you feel about it. Because
I've come to I am free flowing, and I love ideation and generation of ideas and creating kind of entrepreneurial approaches to working. But I have come to highly appreciate structure and rhythm. So the structure of having an organizational strategic framework, and then that doesn't sit on the shelf. It's not the old style strategic plan.
right.
Sits on the you create it and it sits on the shelf for three years when you look at it again. But we're actually working towards that strategic plan on a weekly basis, monthly basis, quarterly meetings and then an annual meeting, so that there's this defined rhythm to our work, and that it all ties to that framework. So I found that really actually helpful. And then I think that's been empowering, because then it helps create clarity. And so when it comes time to thinking about pruning or letting things go, I think you have this perspective of, because you're starting to measure things, you've got some metrics in play, you've got a scorecard, not just on the fundraising side, but overall. And
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
so then it's like, oh, wow, look at that. Like, maybe it's time to cut back. We just don't have the capacity to do everything that we're doing on the program side. Like, can we do an evaluation and an assessment of where's the highest return on investment, and do that sort of more objectively within the context of having a strategic plan and a framework and rhythms and a process for all of that. So for me, at least, that means that it becomes more natural and it's proactive. It's not, you don't have to have these big blow ups.
Right.
You're actually addressing it and have a place to deal with some of the hard decisions.
Yeah. For me, I think having the conversation is hard. It's always hard when you get to a place where maybe you're not quite in crisis, but you know that you have to make some tough decisions. So much easier if you do it incrementally, or if you have such a finger on the pulse of what's happening. But the reality is, most of us, myself included, don't realize we're in too deep until we're almost drowning. And then all of a sudden, you're looking around for a life raft or a life jacket to keep yourself afloat. And then you're kind of operating out of this sort of anxiety, worry, not enough funds, not enough resources. So to your point about rhythm, if you build a reflective piece into your rhythm that always is measuring and checking for healthy growth, and I could go off on a whole bunch of gardening metaphors. I'll spare the folks here today about that. But the reality is you have to be checking all the time for disease, for rot, for non-producing pieces. You have to make adjustments constantly, and with sun and water and all this kind of stuff. It's like, if I leave it too long, it feels overwhelming and I don't know where to start. And so, if someone's in this pruning phase or needing to look at healthy growth, like, where do you recommend they start in terms of, like, maybe they're already at the overwhelmed state? what's the first clip or what's the first bite we have to do.
Yeah. No, I think those are all really helpful insights. And I think we're all in this, in the nonprofit world, we have a high value on hustle and like do whatever it takes, work as many hours as it takes to get the job done. Or, there's this passion and drivenness that we experience. And it's not just in the nonprofit sector, but I think there's a different dynamic in the nonprofit sector than in the business sector around that, where it's driven by cause, not profit.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah.
and so sometimes that's more closely tied and aligned to people's personal values. But it does lead to overextension. And I'm just wondering, Nadia, when is it enough? Like, when can you say we've done enough? Or like, okay, what's healthy versus hustle? And I'm not saying, I mean, I'm a hustler. So, I mean, in the sense that I want to get things done and I will.
Yeah.
But there's kind of like a balance of like what is actually healthy and what is hustle, what is just hustling for the sake of hustling. And is there,
Right.
can we get stuck in that like overwork, unhealthy growth? And what does it take to move towards healthy growth?
Yeah, I mean, I do not profess to be an expert in this area. I think for 25 years, I hustled and like tried to make things work, sacrificed, and I don't regret it. What I wish I had had was someone or some multiple people to kind of say to me, here are some healthy trellises, here are some healthy boundaries for you in order to make it not just work for the nonprofit program wise, impact wise, but to make it work for you as a person, as a leader. I think there's a lot of things I wish I could go back to myself and just be like, you don't actually have to hustle this hard. Like things are unfolding. I think when we can learn to let things unfold and to grow naturally and organically instead of forcing the growth, or I just think that's a healthier place. And so how do we learn pace? How do we learn, because you got to hustle in nonprofit. You always got to be looking for that next donor, that next relationship. But can you find a way to match the pace of growth to the hustle? I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of when I envision it. It's kind of where I wish I had known maybe a little bit earlier.
Yeah,
because I'm not into hustling as much anymore. I'm into like pace.
yes. That sounds wise and good. I think one of the things that might be helpful and that I'm becoming more and more a big believer in is that healthy growth can be measured. So if we're measuring growth, I mean, there's a lot more that's going on, but then we actually, if we know what's happening, then we can actually make decisions on and be intentional about organizationally what kind of growth do we want. Because I think often we're just in this mode of maximizing.
Right.
But if we're actually measuring, we can become more intentional. And we don't need, healthy growth isn't maximizing. It's creating pace, sustainability, rhythms. There's multiple values that we're wanting to live into, including making sure our team members don't burn out and, like all of that. So I think there's something there that, and I was just thinking this idea of like what, as a takeaway, even for today, like even for today, for ourselves, for Casey, for any organization, for anyone listening right now, what's one thing that in your organization that is nourishing, that's really helpful and that you're doing well? And then think about one thing that's draining. You don't have to solve everything, but if you've reflected on the thing that's draining, and is there anything that around that you could stop doing, or what can you change so it's not draining? Just as a simple takeaway. I mean, obviously there's we covered a lot of ground, but I think that might be one simple takeaway. Nadia, do you have other thoughts on takeaways, connections to what Casey could provide, or what people can take away?
I think sometimes these podcasts, these conversations you and I have always lead to more questions. And so that's not a bad thing, but I hope that I think the key point that I'm taking away from this conversation actually is that sort of hustle over health, or health over hustle. and really kind of sitting with that for a bit. I think that's a very nuanced question captured in a very pithy sort of way. But what is health over hustle, and how do we reach for that? And I think your two reflective questions are perfect. And I hope that we come to organizations with that question: what can we let go of? What's life giving? And how do we grow in a healthy sort of way? And I think that's a really beautiful thing that we can offer people.
That's fun. That ties in growing good, healthy.
There you go.
Well, thanks, Nadia. And thanks everyone for
Thanks, Marku.
joining in. See you next time.
See you next time.